So in our house, probably your house, we have rules. And I don't think our family has like a lot of rules. There's some really basic stuff, like no running in the house, don't shove your sibling down the stairs, like no screaming. We're respectful, we're kind. These are not hard rules. Sometimes we have to develop rules for particular circumstances or situations. My parents have told me that when I was growing up, and I remember this, there was a rule that said I was only allowed to spit in two places, in the bathtub or behind the garage. I don't know why we had to have that rule. Like apparently I just was going around spitting everywhere. I don't know. But that was a very important rule in my house. I don't think the rules in my house now are that crazy. But a couple weeks ago we were visiting my parents. And we're driving home and Hunter says, I wish I could live with Nana. I went, yeah, Nana's great. We all love Nana, And he said, no, I wish I could live with Nana. Why do you want to live with Nana? Because she doesn't have as many rules. Child, I lived with Nana for 20 years. That woman has rules, You're just catching something that I have not seen before, and I'm not quite sure yet what to do with. But trust me, she has rules. In this passage, Paul is writing to the church at Ephesus, and he's going to write them some rules. He's giving them this kind of way to live together, and he's kind of starting to challenge them to say, there's a way that you need to be. There's a life that you're called to live so that you can show to the world the unity and witness of Christ. He calls to them and says to do kind of what seems like some basic things, right? Speak truth, care for each other, don't tell lies. He tells them to be kind and not to be angry or bitter or full of bitterness or malice. He's got this basic stuff. But the rules he lays out for the church at Ephesus are not just rules for rules' sake. They are not rules just for the sake of legalism or because Paul doesn't want the people to have fun. They are rules that the church needs to know so that they can live together well. Paul is saying to the Ephesians, you are God's temple. You are God's temple. And this is a powerful statement for him to make because he doesn't just mean, you're a building or a figurehead. When the people hear him say, you are God's temple, they're hearing him say, you are the place where God's presence encounters the world. Think about that for a second, church. We are the place where God's presence encounters the world. We are the people who have been called together to live in such a way that the world might know through our witness the rule and reign of God. And it's not through us as individuals. We can't do this work on our own, but we have been called together as God's people. We have been welcomed into a sense of unity. We have been invited to live out together the call of God, the reign of God, and to announce to our community that God is on the move. So when Paul writes this passage, he's moving from kind of this ethereal, kind of theoretical idea of what that means to what it actually looks like in the nitty-gritty, right? How do you actually live as God's people, as God's temple together? And he's saying you do that by putting away anger, by putting away bitterness and malice and rage. You do that by caring for one another in deep ways. He's calling them to this new, transformed kind of life. Friends, God's Spirit is still working powerful transformation in our world, breaking down hatred and finding people who need new life. I heard a tremendous story this week on NBC News. It was on Friday. You can go back and watch it. But they told the story of a man who a year ago today, marched in Charlottesville as a white nationalist. He marched in full KKK garb. He marched to kind of push forward this agenda of white supremacy. And he talked about in this interview the hatred that he experienced and knew. He had lived that life for many years until Jesus got a hold of him. He was invited to church, and he showed up at this church, and there was an African-American preacher preaching, and this man found faith. He experienced Jesus, and he has set aside his hatred. He has set aside his old ways. He has been baptized, and in his baptism, he has died to himself, and he has found new life. He now worships in an African American church. He's calling for a new way to live. That doesn't just happen. That is the transformation that we can know through Jesus Christ. Amen? So this life that we're called to is a life that is transformed and made new. It's a life that sets aside the old ways, the sinful ways, and becomes something new through Christ's Spirit. And so this is the life that Paul's beginning to call us into. And he says, here's what you need to do. The first thing you need to do is tell the truth. Now, this seems really basic. Like, this seems like one of those, like, first lessons we teach kids. Like, tell the truth, don't tell lies, right? But it's not always that easy, is it? Because sometimes we work really hard to misrepresent ourselves to those around us. We work really hard to make sure that they see the good side of us and they think everything's okay. We work really hard to make sure that we present a good face, that they wouldn't know what's really happening. This call to tell the truth is a call to be vulnerable and open. It's a call to share the truth of who we are and the experience that we have lived, the story of God that has been written on our hearts with those around us. For us to speak the truth is an important thing, but it must be done as people who have been transformed by God's Spirit. It must be done not as a way to manipulate or hurt. It must not be done as a way to injure. It must be done with a sense of kindness and love. It must be done as we seek forgiveness and reconciliation. It must be done as we present a different face to the world. Paul goes on to say, now be angry, but don't let your anger lead you into sin. Don't let the sun go down in your anger. And this is surprising, right? Because in the church we're taught over and over again that anger is not okay, that anger needs to be stifled and held back, that it's better to not be angry than anything else. But Paul says you're allowed to be angry. There are going to be moments in your life together where you are upset with someone. Just don't let it take hold. He's saying that our anger cannot take root, because when anger takes root in our heart, when anger against someone else takes root in our heart, it calls us and leads us into a place of sin. How have you allowed anger to take root in your heart? In such a way that the sun has gone down, and the sun has risen, and the sun has gone down, and the sun has risen, as you continue to hold anger against someone else. Because when that happens, we begin to take hold of that list that Paul gives us of bitterness and malice and wrath. It's interesting to think that some anger is okay, though. I think there is such a thing as holy anger. And I think there are moments in life when we should be angry, particularly when we look at the world around us and see a world that's full of evil and injustice and oppression. Friends, I think we should be angry that today there are white supremacists who gather in our nation's capital to boldly proclaim that there are some who are not fully human, to dehumanize and to steal the image of God from others. That is injustice, that is evil, and that should make us angry. I sometimes think that when we are not angry at injustice and oppression and evil in the world, when we are not ready to rail against it, we have become so complacent that we have fallen into sin. There are moments when anger is okay. It's not okay when anger takes hold and takes root, when anger against another person becomes the way of life that we have become accustomed to. Paul says, don't be angry. Don't be filled with bitterness and wrath and malice. Don't let anger take hold. But instead, be filled with kindness and love and forgiveness and imitate God. What a powerful phrase. Be imitators of God. That is a call for us that's high and mighty, isn't it? It's not always easy to do, but friends, for us to imitate God and to imitate God well means that we are people who live a life of forgiveness, who live a life of sacrifice. It means we are people who live a life of justice. It means that we are people who live a life that is offered for the other. We can't imitate something we don't know, though, can we? And so there's this call inherent in this passage for us to know more of God, more of God's forgiveness, more of God's love, more of God's kindness and grace, so that we can show that to the world. Friends, we are called together as the body, called to love one another, to care for one another, to speak well of each other, called to offer kindness and compassion to those we meet. We are called to live as God's people, proclaiming the reign of God in the world. May we set aside malice and bitterness and wrath. May we live as God's people who proclaim and live a new and better way.